If the most important idea in economics is that God creates the earth and man and woman in his image, and that they work together in productive activity in order to create wealth, and that expanding wealth is reinvested in that productive activity, which leads to even greater expansions in wealth, then that leaves the obvious question, what's gone so horribly wrong? Because anybody who observes the world in recent years understands that it's not working this way. Well, if that's the most important idea in what goes right with the economy, the relationship between God, man, earth, production, economic wealth creation, and financial markets, then the thing that goes wrong in the same place. An alienation in the relationship between God and man creates an alienation in the relationship between people, between generations, between man and the earth. Cursed is the earth with reference to you, or with regards to you, for your sake. It will not yield its fruit to you. And cursed earth alienated from God. And when that happens, when the ground is cursed, when people are alienated from one another, male and female, old and young, productive activity shrinks. The earth brings forth thorns and thistles rather than fruit. And work is toilsome, and people live by the sweat of their brow. Work has a toilsomeness to it. And when production decreases, the range of possibilities for the use of wealth shrinks. It contracts. There's just less wealth. And when there's less wealth, there's less money available for investment. And so as the possibility production's frontier closes and there's contraction in the economy, you find an interruption between investment and capital markets, between wealth and investment. And therefore, less wealth goes into the productive activity. And that causes a further shrinking. And then in this environment of anxiety and alienation, of living by the sweat of your brow, people have a desire for something to replace that relationship. And so not only is there less investment because there's just less wealth, there's also less investment because people move from the point on the investment curve where there's a high level of investment and a low level of consumption. They gravitate towards a situation where there's a low proportion of investment and a high proportion of consumption. You feed your anxieties. People live for the moment when they don't have relationships which anchor them in eternity and in the long run point of view, in the long run way of thinking. And that causes an even greater shrink in the amount of investment. So investment shrinks because there's less wealth, and then investment shrinks again because people spend on themselves a higher proportion of what they create through the fruit of their hands, and therefore invest less of it. And what does all that do in capital markets? Well, remember, this is a trade-off between yield and risk. And in this situation, risk is rising. This is riskier to invest in for a stock investor or for a bond investor. A piece of paper that says, I'm going to give you a share of my future profits is worth less if I'm less confident of your future profits. A piece of paper that says, I'm going to give you a fixed amount every year, an interest payment, I'm going to pay back what you lend to me, is worth less because the productive activity the shrinkage of it makes it less likely that money will be repaid. And so what you have are higher interest rates, higher yields. People need to be compensated for that. And in addition, with less money going in, less available capital, that makes capital scarcer, which makes interest rates even higher. So what do we get? We get a situation where the riskiness of investing shows in this curve pointing more upwards. That's the risk of being a partner with somebody. And the risk of the entire thing goes up. The risk of all investment goes up. The yields go up even more because of the scarcity of capital. And this, unlike the virtuous cycle we saw of how the economy works when it works the way it's supposed to, is what they call a vicious cycle. It feeds on itself. Higher interest rates, more scarce capital creates even lower levels of production, even more shrinkage in economics, even lower levels of investment. So what do people do? Well, they could go back and restore this original relationship or accept the restoration of it, but this is what they tend to do. They create a new entity, the state, or an entity which already existed and now is expanded. And there is a new God in town. And what they try to do is deny this God. They try to erase him from the picture. They can't. He's unerasable, but they can fog the view to him. And the new God says, I will do what the old God did, but even better. I'll give you prosperity. I'll give you abundance. I'll solve this problem. If there's a scarcity of capital, I'll create new dollars, new drachma, new yen, new dinars, whatever the currency is throughout the history of the world. I'll create new ones, and I'll put money in. See, when this yield curve goes up, showing higher levels of risk and lower levels of investment, it tells the truth. It tells us the truth about ourselves. If we're not savers, then that shows up. If we're promise breakers, then that shows up. If we don't work hard, then that shows up in a scarcity of capital, high levels of risk, exorbitantly high yields. The problem is, what if we don't want to hear the truth? What if we don't like the truth? What if we can't handle the truth? Well, one of the things we can do is clap our hands over our ears, and the state helps us do that by putting enormous amounts of new money. And that pushes interest rates down. It looks like a risk-free environment. It looks like an environment with lots of capital. But it's not capital, it's not wealth, it's just money, which they are not the same thing. You can print money infinitely. You can't print wealth infinitely. And so what happens is these yields start to tell a lie. They say, there's no risk, and a capital is abundant. And pets.com can get funded as a business startup, or we can build far more houses than there are actually people to live in them. It sends a lie. It tells us a falsehood about ourselves. That's not a byproduct. That's what it's supposed to do. And so what happens is the state grows, it gets bigger, and wealth that used to go into production and back to God to acknowledge that he's the source of it all, which is a very important investment, because it's the investment that calibrates our minds, that reminds us how reality really works. Money that used to go there now goes here in the form of higher taxes. Money that used to go into production now goes there in the form of higher taxes. Money that used to even go into consumption now goes there in the form of higher taxes. And this shrinks again. And these yields eventually, reality will not be denied. Eventually, as much as we try to fog the name God, that name comes back with a vengeance. And this turns out not to be true. And the bubble bursts and the lie is exposed. And now interest rates begin to rise again because people understand that it wasn't a low-risk environment. It was a high-risk environment pretending to be a low-risk environment. And then they figure out that this happened because money was printed with no regard to the amount of wealth. Money was printed to create a false boom, to create a sense of well-being and abundance where there wasn't one. It was created to tell a lie. Coinage was debased to manipulate us into doing something that we would not otherwise have done. And when that happens, interest rates get extremely high, because now we have to be compensated for the inflation, the risk of inflation for our investments. Not only will they maybe not have growth to pay us dividends, not only may they default on the interest that they owe us when we invest in businesses, but even if they pay us the money back, the money won't be worth nearly as much as when we lent it to them. So that's another risk factor. And finally, even the new God, the king, the self-appointed king, realizes that it's caused inflation. And then it reverses course and it begins to pull money out of the system. And then we get sky-high interest rates. Remember the early 1980s? The false boom of inflation in the 70s leads to the sky-high interest rates of the 80s, where people couldn't afford to own a home or couldn't afford to buy a car because the capital was so scarce, and if you could get some, it was incredibly expensive. So what do we do here? We could go back, re-acknowledge that relationship, be less alienated from one another, go back to productive activity, and grow the pie again. That's what we could do. But what we almost always do is we repeat the process. We see a lack of production, we see a lack of investment, we see sky-high interest rates, and the government says, I can solve this with my printing press. I can solve this by taxing and spending and expanding and the whole thing starts over and over again. And if you want to understand the history of economics in the 20th century and the early 21st century, the history of economics is this yield curve, these interest rates being forced artificially low to create a false sense of boom. Late 60s, early 70s. And then it busts, early 80s. And then we have a tech boom and artificial money creation in the late 90s, and pets.com gets funded, and .coms, every one of them is going to make you a billionaire, allegedly. And then the bust with Enron and it bursts. And then we say, the Fed says, I can solve this problem. I can end the recession of 2000, 2001. Let me just run the printing press. And then we get a housing boom where the interest rates say, build houses, even though there aren't people to live in those houses or people who can afford to buy those houses. And then you get that false boom and then the bust over and over and over again. We gyrate back and forth in a boom and bust cycle where we wonder if it will ever be over. And the answer is it will not ever be over until we understand what's happened, why it happens, the relationship between these different factors, and why it goes wrong in the first place. There is a way out. There is a way out of this.